There are certain moments in life that look ordinary to everyone else, yet carry an entirely different meaning for the person who once shared the dream behind them. And your soulmate may have just experienced one of those moments when they saw you accomplish something you once talked about together. At first, they may have simply looked at it without thinking too much. Perhaps they saw your achievement online, heard about it through someone else, or unexpectedly came across evidence that you had finally done the very thing you once spoke about with excitement. But then something inside them shifted because they remembered. They remembered the conversation. They remembered the way you talked about that dream, perhaps with a smile in your voice, imagining what life could look like when it finally happened. Back then, it may have sounded like a distant possibility, something you hoped would happen someday. Maybe you even talked about how amazing it would feel when you finally reached that point. And perhaps somewhere inside your soulmate, there was an assumption that if that day ever came, they would somehow still be close enough to witness it. But now, the dream has become real and they are seeing it from a distance. That realization can hit much deeper than they expected, because they aren't simply looking at your accomplishment. They are looking at a piece of a future they once heard you describe. Imagine finding an old message from years ago where someone described exactly the life they wanted, and then suddenly discovering that they actually built it. The words are still the same, but the meaning has completely changed. That may be what happened inside your soulmate. They may have stared at what you accomplished a little longer than necessary, wondering how much effort it took, what you went through to get there, and whether you ever remembered that old conversation along the way. They may even feel a strange mixture of pride and sadness because part of them is genuinely happy that you succeeded, while another part is quietly asking why they aren't standing beside you for this moment. And that question may be harder to answer than they expected, because once upon a time, they were part of the conversation about your future. They are witnessing that future unfold without knowing whether there is any place for them inside it. And that is where their emotional reaction truly begins, because what they saw wasn't just your success. They saw proof that you kept moving toward a dream you once talked about together. Even after life took the two of you in different directions, what your soulmate saw may have looked like a simple achievement from the outside. But for them, it may have opened a door to a memory they thought they had already closed. The moment they recognized what you had accomplished, their mind may have immediately traveled backward to that conversation you once shared. Perhaps you were sitting together talking about your future, imagining where you would be someday, discussing something you wanted to build, experience, create, or achieve. Maybe you spoke about it casually, without realizing how deeply those words would eventually stay in their memory. At that time, the dream belonged to the future. It was an idea, a possibility, something that existed only in your imagination. But now, years, months, or even a significant amount of time later, your soulmate is looking at the evidence that you actually made it happen. And that changes the emotional meaning of everything. Because suddenly, the conversation they once considered ordinary becomes a memory attached to something real. They may remember the exact excitement in your voice when you talked about it. They may remember the way your eyes changed when you described what you wanted. They may remember asking you questions about it, encouraging you, teasing you about how ambitious you were, or perhaps even imagining what it would be like when you finally achieved it. And now that moment has arrived, except they aren't necessarily beside you to experience it. That contrast can be surprisingly emotional. Imagine finding an old map you once studied with someone, a map showing a destination you both once talked about reaching, and then discovering that the person actually traveled there while you remained behind. The destination is no longer imaginary. The road was completed. The dream became part of real life. And your soulmate may be realizing that you continued walking long after the two of you stopped walking together. This can create a strange mixture of emotions inside them. They may feel proud of you. They may genuinely smile when they see what you've achieved. They may even feel grateful that something you once dreamed about actually became possible. But beneath that pride, there may be a quiet ache that they weren't there for the moment when it finally happened. They may start wondering whether you remembered them when you reached that milestone. Did that old conversation ever cross your mind? Did you remember the person who once listened to you talk about this dream? Did you ever imagine telling them that you finally did it? Those questions can become much more powerful than the accomplishment itself, because your soulmate may not simply be looking at what you achieved. They may be looking at the space between the person you were when you talked about it and the person you are now that you've accomplished it. And that space represents everything that happened while they were no longer close enough to witness it. They didn't see every setback. They didn't see the moments when you doubted yourself. They didn't see the days when you almost gave up. They didn't see the small decisions that eventually created the result they are now looking at. They are only seeing the finished chapter while you lived every difficult page that came before it. That can make them realize how much of your transformation happened outside their view. Perhaps they once thought they knew you completely because they knew your dreams. But now they may be realizing that knowing someone's dreams is not the same as knowing who they become while pursuing them. You may have changed in ways they never expected. Maybe you became more disciplined, more confident, more patient, more independent. Maybe you stopped waiting for perfect circumstances and simply started taking action. Maybe the thing you once talked about became one of the symbols of your personal growth. And when your soulmate sees it now, they may recognize a version of you they remember, but also a version they don't completely know anymore. This can create a powerful sense of nostalgia because the achievement connects your present to a moment from your shared past. They may remember what life felt like when the two of you were close. They may remember the possibilities you discussed. They may remember how naturally you once talked about the future, perhaps assuming that there would always be more time to figure everything out. But time has a way of turning assumptions into questions. And now they may be asking themselves whether they ever imagined that you would actually reach this point without them. Maybe they believed the connection would eventually return before the dream came true. Maybe they thought there would always be another opportunity to reconnect, another conversation, another moment when the distance would disappear. But now the achievement has happened, and it happened without that reunion. That realization can quietly challenge something inside them. It can make them wonder whether they misunderstood how much time they really had. They may look at your accomplishment and think, "I remember when they used to talk about this." Then another thought follows. "I wonder if they remember that I was there when it was still just a dream." That question can carry a surprising amount of emotional weight, because being present at the beginning of someone's dream creates a special kind of connection. You heard the vision before anyone else knew whether it would become reality. You saw the possibility before the result existed. And now, seeing the result from a distance can make them realize that they once occupied a meaningful place in a chapter that has since evolved beyond them. Perhaps they even feel a strange sense of pride that they knew you when you were still dreaming. But that pride can quickly become bittersweet because the person standing in front of the finished accomplishment may be someone they no longer have direct access to. This is where their mind may begin replaying old conversations. They might remember the exact words you used. They might remember where you were when you talked about it. They might remember what you hoped would happen. They may even wonder whether you ever doubted that you could achieve it. And perhaps they are realizing that the confidence they see in you now was already there in the person they once knew, only waiting for life to reveal it. Imagine watching a seed you once saw planted finally become a tree. You remember the tiny beginning. You remember how fragile it looked. But you were not there for every season that followed. You didn't witness the storms, the heat, the rain, or the years of quiet growth beneath the surface. Then one day you see the tree standing tall, and you realize how much happened without you. That may be how your soulmate is experiencing your accomplishment. They remember the seed of the dream, but they are now looking at the result of everything you became afterward. And that realization can be both beautiful and painful. Beautiful because you achieve something meaningful. Painful because they may wonder whether they could have been part of that journey if circumstances had been different. They may even start thinking about how they would have reacted if they had been there when you finally succeeded. Would they have celebrated with you? Would they have hugged you? Would they have told you how proud they were? Would you have called them first? These imagined moments can create an alternate version of the past in their mind, one where the two of you remained connected long enough to witness each other's milestones. But reality is different. You reached the destination, and they are seeing it from somewhere else. And perhaps that is why their emotional reaction may feel stronger than the situation seems to deserve. To anyone else, it is simply your success. To them, it is a reminder of a shared conversation, an old dream, a version of the future that once felt possible, and a relationship that changed before the dream had a chance to become reality. They may realize that they weren't only watching you accomplish something. They were watching time prove that you meant what you once said. You talked about it, you believed in it, and eventually you did it. And that can make them look at you differently. They may begin respecting the determination they once overlooked. They may admire the fact that you didn't allow the changes in your personal life to destroy your larger vision. And somewhere beneath that admiration, they may quietly wonder whether they underestimated you. Perhaps they assumed you needed the connection to feel motivated. Perhaps they thought losing them would make you lose momentum. Instead, you continued. You grew, you built. You achieved. And now the very dream you once talked about together has become evidence that your story was never dependent on whether they remained beside you. That doesn't erase the meaning of what you shared. If anything, it may make the memory more significant. Because now your soulmate is looking at something real that began as a conversation between two people who once believed they would still be part of each other's futures. And the emotional realization may slowly become unavoidable. They are not just witnessing your achievement. They are witnessing a piece of the future you once talked about together, becoming real in a life they are no longer certain they belong to. What your soulmate is beginning to understand now is much deeper than simply realizing that you accomplished something you once talked about. They are beginning to realize that you actually followed through on a version of yourself they may have once only seen as a possibility. When the two of you discussed that dream, perhaps they saw your excitement, your ambition, and your belief that one day you would make it happen. But at that time, it was still an idea. There was no proof, no finished result, no evidence that the future you imagined would actually arrive. Now they are looking at the evidence, and suddenly they are seeing the difference between the person who talked about becoming something and the person who actually became it. That realization can hit deeply because it forces them to reconsider how well they truly understood you. They may have thought they knew your limits, your fears, your habits, and the things you were capable of accomplishing. But your achievement quietly proves that there were parts of you they never fully discovered. Imagine watching someone you once knew as a dreamer suddenly standing in the middle of the life they once described. You remember when the vision was only words, but now those words have become reality. That can create a strange mixture of admiration and emotional distance, because your soulmate may be proud of you while simultaneously realizing they missed the journey that transformed you. They weren't there for every difficult morning, every moment of doubt, every decision that required courage, or every time you had to choose between giving up and continuing. They are seeing the finished result, but you lived the entire process. And perhaps this is where they begin wondering how much you changed while they weren't looking. Maybe you became more determined. Maybe you stopped seeking validation. Maybe you learned how to trust yourself. Maybe you became comfortable taking risks without needing someone beside you to guarantee the outcome. Your achievement may therefore represent much more than success. It may represent independence. It may represent resilience. It may represent the fact that you learned how to keep moving, even when the person who once shared your dreams was no longer walking beside you. That can be emotionally confronting for your soulmate, because they may remember a version of you who wanted encouragement, reassurance, or someone to believe in the dream alongside you. Now they are seeing that you eventually became capable of believing in yourself. And perhaps they are quietly asking themselves whether they underestimated that strength. They may remember moments when you talked about your plans and wonder whether they truly listened. Maybe they remember giving you casual encouragement without realizing how serious the dream was to you. Maybe they remember joking about it, questioning it, or simply assuming there would always be time to watch you pursue it. But time has a way of turning casual conversations into emotional evidence. What once seemed like an ordinary discussion now looks like the beginning of something significant. They may think back and realize that you were telling them who you wanted to become, but they were not necessarily paying attention to how determined you were to become that person. And now they have proof. The accomplishment becomes a message without you ever having to send one. It says, I remembered what I wanted. I kept going. And I made it happen. Your soulmate may not interpret it that way consciously, but emotionally, that is what they may feel. They may even begin wondering whether you ever thought about the old conversation while working toward the goal. Did you remember their reaction? Did you remember the way they encouraged you? Did you remember the dreams you once discussed together? Or did the entire memory become something you left behind while creating a new life? Those questions can make the accomplishment feel intensely personal to them. They may begin replaying that moment when you first talked about the dream and comparing it with the person they see now. The difference may surprise them. Perhaps back then you were uncertain, nervous, or still trying to understand what you wanted. Today, you appear confident enough to have turned uncertainty into action. That transformation can create a quiet sense of awe. They may realize that they knew the beginning of your story, but they don't know the middle anymore. They don't know what happened when you were struggling. They don't know who encouraged you when you felt discouraged. They don't know how many times you had to rebuild your confidence. They don't know what sacrifices you made. And they certainly don't know every version of yourself you had to leave behind to become the person who achieved this. That gap in their knowledge can make them feel strangely distant from someone they once felt incredibly close to. Imagine knowing the first chapter of a book so well that you believe you understand the entire story, only to discover years later that dozens of chapters were written without you. You recognize the character, but you don't recognize the journey anymore. That may be how your soulmate feels when they look at your achievement. They recognize the dream. They recognize the person who once talked about it, but they are now looking at a version of you shaped by experiences they never witnessed. And that can create an emotional realization that is difficult to ignore. You didn't simply continue the life they remember. You expanded beyond it. Perhaps they begin thinking about the person you are now and wondering whether they would even know how to approach you. Would you still respond the way you once did? Would you still care about the same things? Would the old conversations feel natural, or would they feel like memories belonging to another lifetime? Your accomplishment can make those questions feel more urgent because it demonstrates that your life has moved forward in tangible ways. You aren't simply saying you've changed. There is something visible that proves it, and maybe that is what affects them most. Your growth is no longer an idea they can dismiss. It is standing directly in front of them. It has a result, a shape, a story, and a meaning. They may look at it and realize that while they were living their own life, you were quietly becoming someone stronger. This doesn't necessarily mean they feel jealous. The emotion may be much more complicated than that. They can genuinely admire you and still feel sadness. They can be proud of you and still wish they had been there. They can celebrate your success internally while wondering whether their absence mattered to you. And perhaps they wonder whether you ever wanted them to witness this moment. That thought can be surprisingly painful because it forces them to consider that you may have reached a milestone they once imagined celebrating with you. but you no longer needed them there to make the moment meaningful. The accomplishment stands on its own. Your effort stands on its own. Your happiness stands on its own. And your soulmate may begin realizing that this is one of the biggest changes in you. You no longer require someone else's presence to validate the future you are building. You once talked about the dream together, but you eventually learned how to pursue it independently. You once imagined someone beside you, but you discovered that you could still move forward when the space beside you was empty. And that is powerful because it changes the meaning of the old conversation. What once represented a shared possibility now represents the beginning of your individual transformation. Your soulmate may look back and realize that they were present when the dream was fragile, but absent when it became strong. They may wonder whether they could have contributed something meaningful if they had stayed. They may wonder whether you would have reached the same destination sooner with their support. But eventually, they may have to accept that you reached it through your own journey. And perhaps the most emotional realization is this: they may have once believed that being part of your future was guaranteed simply because they were part of your past. Now they are beginning to understand that your future was never guaranteed to anyone. It had to be earned through growth, consistency, and mutual effort. Your accomplishment shows that you kept a promise to yourself. And as your soulmate looks at what you achieved, they may quietly realize that the person who once dreamed beside them has become someone capable of turning those dreams into reality alone. That realization may not make them forget you. It may make them remember you differently, because now they are not simply remembering who you were. They are finally beginning to understand who you were becoming all along. And this is where the accomplishment begins to carry a much deeper emotional weight for your soulmate. Because after the first wave of surprise and nostalgia fades, they may start thinking about one uncomfortable fact they cannot change. They were not there when the dream finally became real. They may remember how the two of you once talked about it, perhaps imagining what that future would look like, where you would be, what you would have achieved, and how exciting it would feel when everything finally came together. At the time, the future probably felt so far away that neither of you imagined how different life could become before that moment arrived. But now the moment is here, and instead of experiencing it beside you, they are seeing it from somewhere outside your life. That realization can create a quiet form of regret that doesn't necessarily announce itself dramatically. It may simply appear as a thought they can't seem to shake. I wish I could have seen this happen when we were still close. They may imagine what it would have been like to celebrate with you, to hear your excitement directly, to know how hard you worked, and perhaps to tell you how proud they were. They may even wonder whether you ever thought of them when the achievement finally happened. Maybe for a brief second, you remembered that old conversation and the person who once listened to your dream. Maybe you didn't, and they have no way of knowing. That uncertainty can make the memory even more powerful. Imagine standing outside a celebration where the person you once planned to celebrate with is now surrounded by a completely different chapter of their life. You can see the lights, you can see the happiness, you can recognize why the moment matters, but you are no longer certain that there is a seat waiting for you. That may be the emotional position your soulmate is beginning to experience. They may not be angry that you succeeded. They may not even be jealous. They may genuinely feel proud of you, but pride can exist beside sadness when someone realizes they missed a moment they once thought would belong to both of you, and this can cause them to revisit decisions they previously made without questioning them. They may start wondering whether they walked away too quickly, whether they assumed there would always be another chance, whether they believed the connection could simply be paused and resumed whenever the timing felt right. Your achievement may remind them that life doesn't work that way. People keep growing, dreams keep moving, opportunities arrive and disappear, and sometimes the future arrives before we are emotionally prepared to face it. They may look at what you accomplished and realize that while they were imagining some distant possibility, you were actually building the reality. They may wonder how many moments they missed because they were no longer close enough to witness them. Perhaps there were other milestones too, smaller ones they never heard about. Maybe you faced challenges they know nothing about. Maybe you celebrated victories they never knew existed. Maybe there were nights when you doubted yourself and mornings when you chose to continue anyway. Your soulmate may suddenly understand that the accomplishment they are seeing is only the visible part of a much larger journey. And that realization can make them feel the distance between you in a completely different way. Because once upon a time, they may have been someone you naturally told things to. They may have been one of the people who heard about your hopes before they became achievements. Now they are learning about the finished result from a distance, perhaps through a screen, another person, or an unexpected moment. That shift can be emotionally confronting. They may realize that they no longer know the details of your everyday life. They don't know what challenges you faced. They don't know what motivated you when things became difficult. They don't know who encouraged you. They don't know what you sacrificed. They only know that you did it. And perhaps that makes them wonder how much of your transformation happened without them. They may begin asking themselves whether you still resemble the person they remember, or whether the person who once shared those dreams with them has become almost unrecognizable in the best possible way. They may remember your old insecurities and compare them with the confidence they see now. They may remember how uncertain you once were, and compare that with the determination represented by your achievement. And perhaps they finally understand that the version of you they knew was never the finished version. You were still becoming, you were still learning, you were still discovering what you were capable of. And while they may have thought they understood your story because they knew your beginning, they are now realizing they missed entire chapters. That realization can create a very particular kind of longing. It isn't simply longing for you to return. It is longing to have witnessed who you became. They may wish they could go back to the moment when you first told them about the dream and tell that version of you. You are actually going to do it. They may wish they could have stayed long enough to see the transformation. They may wonder whether things would have been different if they had understood the importance of those conversations. And perhaps they are beginning to recognize that sometimes people don't realize they are witnessing the beginning of something important until they are far away from the ending. Your soulmate may now understand that the conversation you once had was not just a casual exchange. It was a glimpse into a future you are already moving toward. And they were lucky enough to hear about it before anyone knew whether it would happen. But now the dream is no longer a possibility. It has become part of your reality, and that can make them wonder whether there is any place for them in the reality you created afterward. They may ask themselves, if I came back now, would they want me there? Would they even tell me about their next dream? Would they still see me as someone who belongs in their future? These questions can create hesitation because they know they cannot simply rely on the closeness you once shared. They would have to build trust again. They would have to understand the person you have become. They would have to accept that your priorities may have changed. And they may even realize that the person who once dreamed with them now has the confidence to dream alone. That can be both inspiring and painful, because there is a difference between losing someone who is still waiting for you and realizing that someone has built a fulfilling life without needing you to return. The first leaves the door open in a familiar way. The second forces you to reconsider whether you still belong on the other side. Your soulmate may be feeling that uncertainty now. They may be looking at your accomplishment and wondering whether they are witnessing the final proof that life moved forward without them. But perhaps the deepest emotion isn't regret about leaving. Perhaps it is regret about assuming there would always be more time, more conversations, more opportunities, more chances to show up, more moments to celebrate, more chances to say what they really felt. They may have believed the dream would happen someday, and perhaps they unconsciously believed they would still be there when it did. Now they are discovering that someday arrived, but the relationship didn't, and that contrast can be incredibly emotional. Yet there is something beautiful hidden inside this realization. Your accomplishment doesn't exist to make them regret anything. It exists because you kept going. You honored something you once wanted. You took an idea and turned it into reality. You became the person capable of achieving what the younger version of you could only imagine. Your soulmate may feel something when they see that, but the achievement belongs to you. It represents your discipline, your resilience, your growth, and every moment when you chose not to give up. And perhaps that is exactly why seeing it affects them so much. They are not simply seeing something you accomplished. They are seeing proof that you became stronger beyond their reach. They are seeing that the future you once talked about did not disappear when the connection changed. It continued, it grew, it became real. And somewhere inside them, they may finally be asking the question they avoided for a long time. If I had stayed, would I still have a place in this life? The answer may not be theirs to determine anymore, because you are no longer standing at the beginning of that dream. You are standing inside the reality you created, and if they ever want to be part of what comes next, they will have to meet the person who made it there. And now comes the realization that may quietly change the way your soulmate looks at everything that happened between you. Because seeing you accomplish something you once talked about together forces them to understand that the dream did not disappear when the connection changed. You carried it forward. You protected it through uncertainty. You continued believing in it even during chapters they never witnessed, and eventually you turned something that once existed only as a conversation into something real. That is what they may be struggling to process now. They may have initially looked at your accomplishment and felt surprised, maybe even proud, but as the moment settled inside them, they may have realized that they were looking at more than your success. They were looking at evidence of your evolution. The person who once talked about that dream is still there, somewhere in their memory. But the person standing behind the achievement has been shaped by everything that happened afterward. And perhaps that is why your accomplishment feels so emotional to them. It gives them a glimpse of the person you became, while they were no longer close enough to see the process. They may wonder how many times you almost gave up and kept going anyway. They may wonder who encouraged you when you felt uncertain. They may wonder what you learned about yourself along the way. They may even wonder whether there was a moment when you thought about the two of you and remembered that old conversation. But they don't know the answer, and that uncertainty may be exactly what keeps the memory alive. They may replay the moment they first heard you talk about the dream and compare it with what they are seeing now. Back then, you may have been excited but uncertain. You may have needed reassurance. You may have been searching for someone who believed in what you were trying to build. Now you are standing in the result. You don't need anyone to convince you that it was possible because you already proved it to yourself. That difference can be incredibly powerful. Your soulmate may realize that you didn't simply achieve something. You developed the confidence to become the person capable of achieving it. And that can make them reconsider every assumption they once had about you. Perhaps they underestimated your determination. Perhaps they thought your dreams were temporary. Perhaps they believed that without their presence, some part of your motivation would disappear. Instead, you continued. You found reasons to keep moving. You built your own momentum. You learned to trust yourself. And eventually, you arrived at the place you once described when the two of you were still connected. Imagine standing in front of a finished painting and remembering when the artist first showed you a blank canvas. You remember the first idea, the colors they talked about, the picture they hoped to create. But you weren't there for every brushstroke. You didn't see the corrections, the mistakes, the moments when the artist stepped away and wondered whether the painting was worth finishing. Then one day, you see the completed work and realize how much happened without you. That may be what your soulmate is experiencing. They remember the blank canvas. They are seeing the finished picture, and they are realizing they missed the entire process that transformed one into the other. This can awaken a very quiet form of regret. Not necessarily regret because you succeeded, but regret because they weren't there to witness the journey. They may wish they could have seen your face when you finally realized you had done it. They may wonder whether you celebrated in a way they would have recognized. They may wonder whether you told someone else first. They may even wonder whether you thought for one brief second, "I wish they could see this." That thought can become emotionally powerful because it represents a possibility they can no longer confirm. They don't know whether they still occupy any meaningful space in your emotional world. They only know that once upon a time, they were close enough to hear your dreams before they became achievements. Now they are far enough away that they have to discover the results indirectly. And perhaps this is the moment when they realize that being part of someone's past does not guarantee a place in their future. They may have assumed that because they knew your dreams, they would eventually know the person you became. But people evolve in ways that cannot always be witnessed from a distance. Your soulmate may now be recognizing that you have developed new standards, new priorities, new boundaries, and a new understanding of what you want from life. The dream may have remained familiar, but the person pursuing it is different. And that means the future itself may look different too. They may start wondering whether the version of you who once imagined a future with them would still want the same future today. That question can be uncomfortable because it shifts the focus away from what you once wanted and toward what you want now. Maybe you still value the connection. Maybe you still remember the conversations. Maybe a part of you still wonders what could have happened. But you are no longer required to remain emotionally positioned where you were when the dream was first discussed. You have lived since then. You have learned. You have experienced things. You have become more aware of yourself. And your soulmate may finally be seeing the evidence of that growth. Perhaps they are asking themselves whether they could fit into your life now without disrupting the peace you worked so hard to create. Perhaps they wonder whether you would even tell them about your next dream. Perhaps they wonder whether they would still be the person you naturally call when something important happens. And maybe the answer isn't clear even to them. That uncertainty can create a strange emotional pull because the achievement has reopened a question they thought time had answered. They may have believed that the distance between you meant the connection was becoming less important. Instead, seeing something you once talked about has shown them that the past can still appear in unexpected places. A goal, a photograph, a place, a milestone, a sentence. Something you once said can suddenly return with a completely different emotional meaning. And perhaps they are realizing that some connections don't disappear simply because people stop talking. Sometimes they transform into memories that remain quiet until something in the present gives them a reason to speak again. Your accomplishment may have been that reason, but there is an important difference between remembering the past and being trapped in it. You are allowed to honor the person who once dreamed without becoming that person again. You are allowed to remember the conversations without needing to recreate the circumstances in which they happened. You are allowed to acknowledge that someone mattered without allowing them to determine where your life goes next. And your soulmate may be learning that from a distance. They may be seeing that your success didn't come from pretending the past never existed. It came from taking everything you experienced and continuing to build. Maybe the connection taught you patience. Maybe it taught you boundaries. Maybe it taught you what you need from another person. Maybe it simply taught you that your dreams cannot depend on someone else's presence. Whatever the lesson was, you carried it forward. And now your soulmate is seeing the result. They may feel proud. They may feel nostalgic. They may feel regret. They may even feel a quiet desire to reconnect. But beneath all of those emotions is one unavoidable truth. The person they once knew has continued becoming someone they cannot fully define through old memories anymore. If they ever return, they cannot simply return to the conversation where the dream began. They would have to meet you at the place where the dream ended and a new chapter began. They would have to understand that you are no longer waiting for someone to believe in your potential. You have already demonstrated what you can do. You are no longer asking whether the future is possible. You are living inside the proof that it was. And perhaps that is the most emotional part for your soulmate. They may have once imagined themselves standing beside you when this moment arrived. They may have assumed there would always be enough time for the two of you to figure things out. But now they are watching from somewhere outside the picture, realizing that the future doesn't pause for unresolved feelings. It keeps moving, and you moved with it. You didn't accomplish this to make them notice. You didn't achieve it so they would regret leaving. You did it because the dream mattered to you. That makes the moment even more meaningful. Your success belongs to the version of you who refused to let disappointment become the end of your story. And if your soulmate feels something when they see it, that feeling belongs to them. Perhaps it will make them appreciate you more deeply. Perhaps it will make them reflect on what they lost. Perhaps it will inspire them to finally confront feelings they avoided. But none of that changes the most important truth. You kept going. You turned a conversation into a reality. You turned an old possibility into a present accomplishment. And somewhere along the way, you became the person you once talked about becoming. So if your soulmate is quietly emotional after seeing what you achieved, perhaps it isn't simply because they miss you. Perhaps they are realizing that they were once close enough to witness the beginning of a dream, but they never imagined they might one day have to watch the ending from a distance.